Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Executive Education Seminar, Brain Science and Bias, How Your Brain Works to Prevent Racism. My name is Jim Ludema, and I'm the director of the Center for Values-Driven Leadership at Benedictine University and a professor of global leadership in our executive doctoral program. And it is my honor today to host our session. I want to begin with a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'll take a moment to introduce the Center for Values-Driven Leadership and introduce our keynote speakers for today, Barbara Steele and Khalil Smith of the Neuro Leadership Institute. After that, I'll turn things over to Barbara and Khalil for their presentation and dialogue with you until about 12:40 Central Time. And then I'll give some concluding comments and we'll wrap up by 12:45. In terms of housekeeping, we'll ask that you please keep yourself on mute with your video off. That will allow everyone to hear Barbara and Khalil clearly and focus on them and their presentation. But we definitely want to hear from you via the chat box. It has been enabled so that you can make comments and ask questions directly to Khalil and Barbara, and they will respond to your questions and comments throughout the presentation. So please make good use of that chat box. And now for a brief word about the Center for Values-Driven Leadership. Our mission is to help values-driven leaders develop themselves and others, build flourishing companies, and transform business and society. And there's never been a greater need for values-driven leaders than now, as we confront what is perhaps the most pressing issue of our time, the reality and destructive impact of systemic racism. Those of you who have joined us for other sessions will know that our center is on a long-term journey to better understand racism, diversity, and inclusion, to amplify the voices of diverse leaders and scholars, and to take action. And one of the forms of action is to host this free executive education series on addressing racism and building inclusive organizations, of which today's seminar is the fourth. You can find recordings of the first three sessions and registration for our upcoming sessions on our website, and our colleague Amber Johnson will share the link to those sessions in the chat box now. Separately, I want to mention that our center is home to a PhD program designed for senior executives. The program is a 3-year program and meets once a month on weekends so that leaders can continue to lead their companies while they pursue their PhD. So if you've ever considered earning your doctorate, now is the time to explore the program in preparation for our November application deadline and the launch of our next cohort in April. Those of you who are interested, Amber will share a link to our doctoral program in the chat box as well. So without further delay, it is my pleasure now to introduce today's speakers. First is Barbara Steele. And Barbara is the performance practice lead at the Neuro Leadership Institute. She's responsible for leading key client engagements by collaborating with organizations on their strategic initiatives, which impact performance and culture transformation, leadership and employee behavior change, and overall business performance. In addition to a distinguished career in consulting, Barbara is a published author and experienced speaker, specializing in topics related to the Neuro Leadership Institute's cutting-edge research. Barbara earned her MBA in Organizational Behavior and Marketing from Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, her BBA in Management Science from Loyola University of Chicago, and she is currently writing her dissertation to earn her PhD in Values-Driven Leadership here at Benedictine University. Today, Barbara is joined by Khalil Smith, the Neuro Leadership Institute's VP of Research, Practices, and Consulting. Khalil leads consulting in 3 key practice areas: leadership, diversity and inclusion, and performance. Before coming to the Neuro Leadership Institute, Khalil led his own consulting firm and spent 14 years in senior roles with Apple. He holds an MBA with a dual concentration in leadership and strategy from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So Barbara and Khalil, we are absolutely delighted to have you with us here today, and we can't wait to learn from you. So take it away. It's all yours.
Excellent, Jim. Thank you so much for that warm welcome and introduction on behalf of Khalil and myself. We are so happy and honored to be here and be part of this conversation. And for those of you who are joining us, thank you so much. So as Jem mentioned, Khalil and I sit in the consulting practice as part of the Neuro Leadership Institute. And we have the privilege, for those of you who aren't familiar with our work, and you might hear Khalil and I just refer to it as NLI, because that's how we refer to ourselves. But we're fortunate to be a part of this great organization that's been in existence for about 20 years. And we are a research consultancy that specializes in human capital. And really, our mission is about how do we help organizations be more human? And that's probably a bit of an oxymoron, right? Because you're probably thinking, how do you take something like science and use that to help make organizations more human? And that's exactly what Khalil and I want to speak to you about today, just the role that neuroscience plays, especially when it comes to sensitive and complex topics like what we're addressing today, the topic of diversity and inclusion, when it comes to the conversation around things like unconscious bias, systemic racism. How does neuroscience play a role, and how can it be beneficial, whether it's to you as an individual or inside of the organizations, given the role that you occupy? So neuroscience might sound like it could be a snoozer. I promise you, Khalil and I will make it interesting. We won't get too technical so that you are very much engaged. Like Jim said, we'll be monitoring the chat constantly. So feel free to share with us either insights that are coming up for you, drop in there, because that way we can all be communicating with one another. And then also be certain to drop in questions, and we will do our best to answer as many of them as we go along. So with that, Khalil, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick us off.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you, Jim, for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Excited to have this conversation with you. I think one of the first things that is critically important when we're talking about diversity and inclusion and bias and racism and equity and fairness and all of those are to start with some definitions. And so I'm going to start with just a handful of definitions that I have found to be really useful. And I think one of the things that's important to kind of disaggregate and to pull apart is diversity and inclusion and bias, because so often when we talk about them, we talk about D&I or I and D, and we can conflate them. And when we start to address one thing with the tools of another, or start to solve for one area of opportunity with the mechanisms that are really beneficial for something else, then we find that we may put a lot of effort and energy in and yet not really see the progress that we're looking for. And so part of what we're going to do is separate those things out. And we'll even do that as it relates to talking about unconscious bias and racism. So I'm going to take us through a bit of that. But a metaphor that I like to use in kind of separating these is this idea that diversity is having a seat at the table, inclusion is having a voice at the table, and bias is part of why some voices are listened to more than others. And so I've used this over and over because I find it to be really helpful for me. And I also tend to ask folks is, have you ever been in a meeting where you have raised an idea and it kind of went over, nobody really paid attention to it, we just kind of moved on in terms of the conversation. And then maybe 5 or 10 minutes later, somebody else raises a very similar idea, but the reaction is very different, right? People say, oh my gosh, that's such a great idea. I'm so glad you brought that up. And you're sitting there thinking, of course it's a great idea. It was my idea. I said that a couple of minutes ago. Why aren't you paying attention? And what we know is that over and over again, when any of us feel like we're not being heard or seen or valued or respected, we are less likely to to continue to contribute and less likely to want to stay in that environment and persevere or provide our discretionary effort or provide our unique thoughts and contribution. And so what we want to do is start to unpack a little bit of that bias and unpack a little bit of what's happening in our brains, and what we know about the science of bias, but not only what we know about it, but also how to mitigate it. Because just being aware of it doesn't get us to the point of actually doing something different. And so for the purposes of this conversation, what I would love for us to do, because I think both bias and, as we talk about, when we'll talk about in a moment, racism, have very, very broad definitions in a lot of spaces. And so even as you dig into the literature, we define it differently, we look at it differently, we research it differently. And so while I won't try and change your mind completely on how you might kind of view it or think about it in everyday terms, for the purposes of this conversation, it's really useful to be able to anchor on a particular definition. And that definition that I'd ask us to anchor on as it relates to unconscious bias is accidental, unintended, subtle, and unconscious choices made by everyone all the time. And we talk quite a bit at NLI about this idea that if you have a brain, you have bias. Now, even within bias, there are different ways of pulling it apart. So there are cognitive biases, which are just things that you are almost kind of born with and evolved with, and there are, our evolution is kind of predisposed us to certain things. There are unconscious biases. It may be a part of what we consume in terms of media or things that we're over or underexposed to. But just bias as a whole tend to be things that operate underneath our consciousness, that we're not intentionally kind of actively leaning into anything in particular. It is just always influencing us. And so if we recognize and accept that if you have a brain, you have bias, well, that's the first part of it. What we then need to do is label that bias. So just knowing that it's there and knowing that there are a bunch of them. And when I say a bunch of them, what I mean is that there are over 150 different types of cognitive biases that have been identified by social psychologists and researchers. And so if I were to give you 150 of anything and say, go off to your organization and mitigate all of these 150 things, don't do all of these 150 things, we all know it would just be completely overwhelming. It's not realistic for us to carry around a list of 150 different types of biases. And the fact that we continue to find more and uncover more and separate these out and define them more deeply. And so what we've done at NLI is compartmentalize these, right? To understand, it's wonderful that they are uniquely identified and that we can pull them apart if we really want to understand the kind of micro difference between one and another. But when it comes to being able to understand these and do something with them, as busy executives, as people that are trying to just make better decisions in our everyday lives as it relates to both people decisions and business decisions, there's value in really understanding how are these things more similar than they are different, and how do we identify the critical few that will allow us to really make better decisions. And so a model that we created with lots and lots of incredible researchers and PhDs and social psychologists is called the SEEDS model. And so I'll walk you through that briefly and then walk you through what you can actually do with the SEEDS model. Because again, if we accept that our brains are biased and that all of us have these biases, the next thing to do is to label. And what SEEDS allows us to do, and SEEDS is an acronym, stands for similarity, expedience, experience, distance, and safety. And those are the 5 overarching categories of bias that all of those other 150 can be almost kind of come underneath that umbrella. And so similarity bias is this idea or this feeling that people like me are better than others. And so if you've ever, we tend to think of these in terms of either race or gender, but they're also very salient. If you've ever gone to a football match or a soccer match or a baseball match, and you see people that are wearing the same team colors that you are, you probably had a bit of an affinity for those folks over the quote unquote competition or your out group. If you've ever traveled to another part of the world and you heard somebody speaking your native tongue, part of what I have absolutely found is that immediately there's a kinship with this person. And I'm in North Carolina and I ask them where they're from and they say Kentucky. And all of a sudden we're best of friends. Where if I were to meet that person in an everyday, Starbucks, and I said, where are you from? And they said, Kentucky. It said, oh, nice state. keep moving, right? But that similarity, that feeling of in group when we feel the need to connect to other people does create this kinship and create this kind of relatedness. Expedience bias, again, this feeling that like, if my gut tells me, then I should just go with it. Right. That's a bit of where things like stereotyping tend to come from, is that I've been exposed to this thing over and over again, whether real or fabricated or imagined. And so it feels right. I'm going to lean into this idea. I'm going to just kind of go with it. And we see that as it relates to hiring and promotions and who gets critical projects and tasks, who are some of the people that we sponsor or lift up in our organizations. But we see it in any number of other experiences as well, where we just go with our gut. And that's not always a bad thing, but in the absence of critical feedback about whether or not our guts are right, we tend to lean into this expedience bias. Experience bias, I think, is one that most of us are pretty familiar with. If you remember the dress that broke the internet, where we were having these vehement disagreements about whether it was white and gold or blue and black, or we've also written and talked about the Yanny versus Laurel. There was an audio clip circulating probably about 2 years ago, and there were such virulent defenses of, what do you mean you hear this? You need to get your hearing checked. Right? That is an experience bias, to say my view of the world is accurate, and anyone who doesn't view things in a similar way is either ignorant or malicious, right? But in reality, we view our world through a particular lens, and that lens is contributed to us by our brains. It tells us a lot of things that may not be 100% objectively true about the world. And so what we need to do is be deliberate about mitigating that experience bias, and I'll tell you how in just a slide. Distance bias, that closer is better than distant. So we value things that are physically closer to us. We value things that we own. We value things that are closer to us in terms of time. And so there's research that shows that people that sit, when we were in offices, sit closer to their bosses, get promoted more often and get better feedback. It's part of the reason that real estate transactions are so challenging, is because I own my house and all of the kind of nooks and crannies, and I value those things. Somebody who doesn't value those things in the same way is not going to want to pay the same amount of money. And yet that endowment effect is what we call it, sits underneath that distance bias of, it's closer to me, it is more salient to me, therefore I care more about it, and I will ignore some things that are a bit further into the future or further away from me. And then safety bias. We've got about 5 times as much real estate in our brains to detect threat as we do to detect reward. And so we are much more likely, and again, this comes from a purely evolutionary standpoint, that all of our ancestors that said, well, there's a fruit tree over there, but I hear some rustling in the distance. There might be a tiger, or it might be some type of animal. I can either get lunch or I can be lunch. You know what? I'm just going to go in the opposite direction. I'll wait. Those were the ones that are a bit more risk averse. And therefore, they're the ones that made it back to camp and procreated and continued to have us. And they are our ancestors. The ones that were a bit more less risk sensitive are the ones that did run into issues or weren't able to kind of get back and share their genes. And so we've just evolved to be more risk sensitive in a lot of these ways. Now, again, none of these things are bad in and of themselves, and yet they absolutely have implications for the way that we show up and the way that we work and the way that we interact with others. And so some things that we can do very quickly around mitigation, and then I want to kind of compare and contrast what we're talking about in terms of bias with what so many of us think about in terms of racism and the differences between those two things, is that mitigating these biases is deceptively simple and yet challenging to actually execute long term. And Barbara's going to talk to us a little bit about how do you institutionalize some of this to the point where you don't always have to put in the same amount of energy to try and solve for these things, because we know that they're always going to be present. So in terms of similarity bias, find commonalities with other people. You can bring lots and lots of people into your in-group. And you've heard it said many times that we have more in common than we do, that is uncommon, or we're more similar than we are dissimilar. Expedience bias is a little bit of just slow down and paint a complete picture. So instead of just going with your gut, it doesn't mean swinging the pendulum and falling victim to analysis paralysis, but it does mean slowing down just a bit to say, is there another point of view that would be helpful? Is there more information that I could bring into this conversation or into this analysis? For an experience bias, get other perspectives, right? It's always going to be challenging for us to see the world through someone else's point of view. We can do what's called perspective taking. In a lot of ways, that is kind of the basis of things like empathy. And yet it is cognitively draining to try to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. And the only thing better than perspective taking is perspective getting, right? To ask someone else for their point of view is really valuable versus trying to envision, well, I wonder how Khalil would view this. Why not pick up the phone or hop on a Zoom chat and ask Khalil how he would think about this? Distance bias, if you can remove distance from the equation, then you can mitigate that bias. And so back to that kind of comment around people that sit closer to the boss, we know when there were kind of home office employees and remote employees, this would come up frequently in organizations where people would say, our remote employees feel like they don't have a voice, or if you're working from home, it's really challenging to get promoted. Well, if you were to remove that and say, well, if we sent everyone home, what would this feel like? And in a lot of ways, that's what we're experiencing right now, is that we have leveled that playing field, and we're starting to see what is it like when everyone works virtually or everyone is in the office. Now we can start to assess performance and quality in very different ways. And then safety is to take the focus off of the risk and focus on gains. So when we think about those people decisions that we're talking about, one of the things that can come up is, well, but what if he doesn't work out? Or what if we take the risk and this doesn't work well? But also flipping that and starting to think about, but what would be the upside if things went really well? And we see that as well in some of the conversations that we have with organizations that have said, we've stopped talking about culture fit, and now we talk about culture addition. And so it is less about, does this person already fit into what we have and what we do, and more about how can we identify those places where people are absolutely adding to what we've already been doing. And so I'll pause in just another moment before I transition over to Barbara, but I'm seeing comments come through in the chat, so love that people are getting in there, and I'll pull those up in a moment and we can answer some of those. But I do want to kind of compare and contrast, and we've written a little bit about this, and this is, as Jim was saying, one of the areas that can be challenging to have that conversation, and Barbara was talking about it as well, that right now there is so much conversation happening, rightfully so, around bias and racism and systemic racism, and how do we solve for those things. And part of what we believe, our hypothesis as we've gone through the data and worked with organizations, is that in some ways the biases that we're talking about are much more pervasive than what we see in terms of outright and blatant racism in organizations. Now, that is to be lauded. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And absolutely, we want to solve for both of those things. So we want to look and find places where racism is coming in our organizations. And let me tell you a little bit about what I mean when I'm describing that, or kind of comparing these two or drawing that contrast. And so bias, we just talked about, is being largely unintentional, right? It doesn't mean it's always invisible. It doesn't mean that we can't raise the awareness of it, but it does mean that without any outside influence, those things that we just talked about in terms of similarity bias and expedience bias, those are evolutionary, right? The things that we see in our general vicinity or in our environment, those are constantly informing what is going on and how we're making decisions. That bias, we can argue, on the whole, tends to be largely unintentional. Racism tends to be more intentional. And you'll notice that I say things like tends to be, because again, there's some debate in the literature around things like, well, would we still call it racism even if it's unintentional? Do we call it bias if it's intentional? But if we separate these things out just for the purposes of this discussion and really understanding them, is that an ardent belief that one group of people is superior to another based solely on race is not biological, right? It is not evolutionary. And that is kind of the second truth, is that racism is not biological, but much bias is. So when I'm talking about those cognitive biases, when I'm saying that regardless of where you go, anywhere in the world, any population that you might experience, regardless of generations or demographics or gender or ethnicity or any of those other things, you will see those biases come out over and over and over again because they are biological and evolutionary. And yet racism is absolutely a set of ideas, a set of very particular kind of points of view. And in a lot of ways, social psychologists, at least a decent number of them, would argue that race is a social construct in and of itself, that it actually isn't real, that there's more kind of variation between groups and within groups than there are in any other space. And so it has been kind of constructed in order to fit a particular narrative, because if you wanted to enslave an entire group of people, it's very difficult to say, well, we're all equal, but these folks we're going to do different things to, right? We're going to treat them in very, very different ways. And so race, as we kind of go back and look at it from a sociological standpoint, was instituted to be able to say, well, no, they're different. Right? They're functionally different. They're different in terms of any number of things that we can imagine. And so what we're doing is really separating those things out and saying, we know that bias is pervasive. We see it in so many of our institutions, so many of our processes, so many of the things that we do. And then there is racism, which is absolutely real and absolutely true. And yet, in some instances, may not be as broad as every hiring process that we're experiencing, every compensation process that we're experiencing. And that goes to kind of this final piece that we've been really investigating and pulling apart and seeking to understand and validate through some of the work that we're looking at, is this idea that racism tends to influence individuals. So especially nowadays, you can absolutely go back and look at racist systems as a whole. But if we continue to draw this distinction between intentional and unintentional, what we look at is we may see a police officer who is racist, but we see a judicial system that is biased. We may see a teacher that is racist, but we see an education system that is biased. And so even the best and most well-intentioned teachers, the research shows, tend to discipline, suspend, and expel Black and brown students at higher rates than their white counterparts. Now, there may be nothing intentional about that, but the biases that we bring into these conversations, our own biases, our own history, our own expedience biases, lead us down a particular path and lead us to believe certain things, and we operate in those ways. And so when we look at systems, we can see a lot of that bias. We see it in artificial intelligence, we see it in education, we see it in the judicial system, we see it in housing, we see it in the credit system. Those are places where bias is creeping in that so many of us, myself included, are complicit without even really understanding some of the underlying mechanisms. And so if we pull those and kind of separate them out, what we see is, and an analogy that we've used before is, it's almost like shark attacks versus mosquito deaths. Shark attacks tend to take about 10 deaths per year globally. Mosquito deaths are in the neighborhood of about 800,000 deaths per year. And yet, because one of those is so much more salient and so much more visible, we tend to over anchor on one versus the other. And that's why we feel like understanding these biases, understanding this work, understanding all of it allows us to approach both of these and really be selective and deliberate about how we mitigate and how we actually dismantle some of those systems. So Barbara, I'm going to turn it over to you, if that's okay, to talk us a little bit about some of those systems. So let me know and I'll move to the next slide.
Yeah, Khalil, I do want to toss a question at you first
Absolutely.
before I continue on. So this question that came in, it's in reference to how working from home and the role that can play when it comes to distance bias. There are a couple things here it'd be great for you to unpack, but let's just start with that, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, there absolutely is a distance bias. And yet what we found is that there is a little bit of the leveling of the playing field, which is what I spoke about before, because we've tended to have some folks that have worked remotely and other people that have worked in the office. So if you've ever been one of those people that there was a meeting going on and there were a bunch of people around the table and they just kept talking to one another, and you were on the phone or on video and could barely get a word in edgewise and basically said, I don't even know why I wound up joining this call, by the time they ask for my opinion, everything's already been said. By the time they remember I'm on, things have already, moved on. So part of what we're seeing is that things like Zoom and things like working remotely are leveling that to the point where we are hearing more voices, we are hearing more people brought in, and yet there absolutely is the flip side of that, which is the distance that you're talking about, which is I'm in my own space, everybody else is in their own space, we're not connecting in the same way anymore. We don't have what I always call kind of that serendipity of just, oh, I was just walking through the office and I happened to see you, and I forgot that we haven't spoken in a while, and so now we want to connect. And so what I'm seeing across organizations, and I think what many of us are seeing, is that if you're not intentional about keeping up those relationships, then that can be where the distance bias comes in. Because if we don't have to work together, or we're not on projects, or we're not on regular meetings, then it just becomes very easy for days and weeks and months to go by and without remembering that I actually haven't connected with that other person, or continue to maintain that relationship.
So helpful, Khalil. And another piece to the question here is, are there any other implications when it comes to bias, given what we've been experiencing with COVID, having to work from home, just as you were just talking about distance bias, but any other implications that we've seen, Khalil?
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, the biases that we've identified, kind of because again, these are all encompassing, they're amplified in certain ways. And so we're seeing almost the stretching, if you will, which is the similarity bias. So if I connect with you and I have a similar situation to you, well, then you're in my in group, right? I happen to have a 9-year-old that is, going through, for a while was doing remote learning and now has just gone back in. And when I bring that up and other parents are saying, oh my gosh, yeah, the math homework, that was crazy. And I can't even remember how to do variables, right? There's an instant connectivity there, that for some other people, it may be more challenging for me when somebody is, single and a bit younger in their career and they're working out of their studio apartment and, trying to figure out how to make it work. My goal is always to find that connection, but for some other people, it's just there more easily. Or our experience bias as well. Again, all of those things that I just described are my experience of this pandemic and the work associated with it. If I'm not intentionally going out of my way to say, what are you experiencing? How can I help? What are you going through? And actively trying to understand other points of view, then I start to think that my experience is the reality and that that's what people are going through. And so whether that is, wow, I'm not spending 100,000 miles on the road anymore. I can see, there are these slight silver linings here. But for some other people, it has been nothing but challenges the entire time. And so what I need to do is get out of my own head and understand these various perspectives, especially as a leader, as so many people on the line are today, that it's not about just my own individual experience anymore. It really is about being able to understand and both synthesize those so that I can make decisions for my team as a whole, but also separate them so that I can make decisions for each individual person who's a part of my kind of, suite of responsibilities.
Yeah, really helpful, Khalil. Thanks for that. Well,
Yeah,
it looks
thank
like
you.
that's it for now, folks. Keep questions coming into the chat. As Khalil mentioned, so he's walked us through kind of the way that we unpack in terms of talking about when we mean bias versus diversity versus inclusion. How does the brain, understanding of the brain science come into play? And then distinguishing what do we mean by bias versus racism? So all of these things clearly really important. And so we just want to shift and go, okay, now that we've kind of level set, making these important distinctions through that lens of brain science, then what does that mean in terms of how do you move forward? So how do you as a leader kind of implement this inside of your organizations or be a part of the solution to kind of move the agenda forward when it comes to these topics? And at Neuroleadership Institute, we use a framework that's really helpful when we consult with our clients that are leading transformation efforts. And it's something that we refer to as is priorities, habits, and systems. And so what we'll do is just unpack these, and to speak of them probably doesn't evoke this, oh, I've never heard of that before. But what's more important is to unpack them to speak to how interdependent they are and how one without the other does not lead to the transformation or drive towards the outcomes that organizations ultimately seek. And so when we're talking about especially sensitive topics such as today's conversation around unconscious bias or talking about racism and what have you, then we just want to look at, so how do you really move that proverbial needle, especially at the organizational level? So when we talk about priorities, really, that is clearly the reference to when that organization says this is something that's really important to us. It is something that we're going to devote, our attention to. We'll commit resources, and we're expecting a certain kind of change. And everybody on this line knows, if you're not a CEO who's joined us today, certainly you know from the CEO in your organization or ones that you work with, that usually when that individual says this is going to happen, it matters, right? Because obviously it's coming literally from the top and it is cascading through the organization, that this is something that needs to happen. And I wanted to just cite, like, as a reference. So when it comes to specifically the topic of diversity and inclusion, many of you probably know, so Deloitte, and they're my former employer, they do or publish a report called Human Capital Trends every year. And roughly 2 years ago, it was the case where when it came to the topic of like diversity and inclusion, what was going on there. And usually in this report, now this is when I was still there, roughly about 40% of that population that's included in the survey are in fact CEOs. And they all had said that diversity and inclusion was a top priority for them. And it was something that they were going to personally own. And so that's what we're talking about here in terms of inside of an organization. If we really want to ensure that change is going to take place, we certainly know the CEO has to be behind it. And we even find, Khalil and myself, that in doing this work, just saying it is important and a first step. But even that's not enough to really drive through the change that's needed. It really also is about their action. And so, a quick story, many of you probably recall, this probably was about 2 months ago when actually it was just after the George Floyd tragedy on May 25th. And Jeff Bezos, who is maniacal about customer service, right? So that is his vision for Amazon, to say the least. And he put his stake in the ground, made a very public statement about dealing with racism, systemic racism, and expressed support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of his customers took offense at that and said that he didn't know that he would continue shopping at Amazon because they were making such a political stance. And it is the first time, they said, that he's gone on record to actually say in a very public way that if you don't understand how important this topic is for our society, and certainly for my organization at Amazon, for us to resolve this, then you're a customer that we can afford to lose. And that just sent shockwaves, right? And so that's what we're talking about in terms of priorities. So it's not just enough just to say, diversity and inclusion is important to us, and so let's do something about it. It is really demonstrating, right, that it's critically important. In addition to the priorities, the next kind of thing that's really important is then the habits or the behavior that we see from individuals. And so I was meeting with a chief human resources officer last week, and they are, as so many organizations are, shoring up their D&I strategy. And he said to me, he goes, Barbara, I've been doing research on unconscious bias training, and there's so much data that shows that it's not working, right? And so Khalil, of course, has spoken to us about that, kind of what are the upsides of that training in terms of raising awareness, but how it doesn't actually change one's own behavior when it comes to bias. And so that's where understanding kind of neuroscience is helpful. And that's what we mean when we're talking about habits, which is this isn't just about looking at the behavior of others, but how do we actually um, enable behavior change in individuals. And the key to doing that is ensuring that the individual experiences what we call a reward state. So, not surprising to anybody on this call that from a brain based perspective, if we see that as something that we get some benefit from, there's something that happens to us chemically in the brain and physical response in the body, but also it is something that helps us, mentally, emotionally, psychologically. And so, how do we tap into that so that we can get people to go from, perhaps the current behavior that could be exclusion of others to a different behavior that is, in fact, inclusive of others? And with neuroscience, so let's say that is, being less biased is what we want. The solution might be that unconscious bias training, but then again, teaching people, right, how to really be aware of others' bias rather than themselves. And so the real key is to understand how do we help people really experience that reward state in the brain so that it's something that is important to them, not because it's compliant and is something that they're being told to do. And then ultimately, just the repetition of that is what ultimately leads to someone, as an example, demonstrating less bias. And there's more to it than that, obviously, but being less biased and more importantly, being also inclusive of others. So that's what we're talking about with respect to habits. And before leaving this, and how do you do that across the organization, right? So we need that in terms of a critical mass to then ultimately see a culture shift. And then lastly, what needs to happen is reinforcement. So how do we ensure at the systems level that really what's in place is designed to reinforce the behaviors that we expect? So especially when we're talking about behaviors that are new habits for individuals, then the system needs to support that. So if we say inside the organization, inclusion is important, but the experience that's playing out is that we reward intolerance because somebody might be killing it in terms of how they perform, but they're completely intolerant of others. That's what people pay attention to. So the system is not compatible with what we're saying, what we value in terms of the culture. And so that is what individuals will take their cues from, is how they're being reinforced to actually engage in the new behaviors. And that is also a critical piece that organizations need to take a look at with respect to not just in terms of training, but if we take different talent processes like a calibration meeting, for example, how do we talk about individuals in a setting like that? If we have to make some decisions about letting X percent of people go because of the economy has, spiraled down, and we need to downsize, has the implication been that, wow, a lot of Black and brown people were let go and women, and we didn't even notice that, but we say we value everybody. So that's what we mean at the systems level, is you really have to look across talent, domains, and processes to ensure all these things are in alignment, because then when they fit together, that's what ultimately leads to real change. So I know we had that's pretty much it in terms of what we wanted to talk about, Khalil. I'm not sure if there are other questions in the chat, but I do want to make sure I turn it over to you, Jim, because I think you had a few other comments that you wanted to share before closing.
You bet. Well, thank you so much, Barbara and Khalil. I think we do need to bring things to a close. It is a fascinating topic, an important and significant topic, and you have given us great content and much to think about. I really appreciate your being with us today and offering your thoughts and insights on this topic. As we close today, I want to remind you that our next free executive education seminar is November 12th, and will focus on leading in contexts of complexity with one of the world's top scholars on the topic, Dr. Mary Ulbin from Texas Christian University. And then in December, we'll return to this series on addressing racism and building inclusive organizations with a session on really practical strategies for building inclusive organizations with Dr. Selwa Rahim Dillard, who is president and CEO of Equision, a global diversity and inclusion consulting firm, and Jenna Lovett, the former chief diversity officer of Alcoa and vice president of manufacturing, safety, and quality for Boeing's Defense, Space, and Security Division. You don't want to miss that one, so please use the link there on the screen to register if you haven't already. We'll also share again the link to learn more about our PhD program in values-driven leadership for senior executives. This program is a place where you can come and explore leadership questions and ideas you're passionate about, and then conduct original research to become a creator of new knowledge in the leadership space. I hope you'll learn more about that program. Finally, I want to thank all of you for attending and for doing the work of addressing racism and building inclusive organizations. We are delighted that we are in this work together. And just a big thanks again to Barbara and Khalil for bringing your insights, your knowledge, and your research to this very important topic. So with that, we are adjourned, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.